아래랑도 고알의 기와 렘비기 지길렌 죄들라 가나가래 요래시네 가상한도 지위에 제가는 용으로시네 아니 지금.
Good morning. So last night we continued to look at the process by which one takes rebirth in samsara. So this section has three main outlines, and we've looked at the first two, that of afflictions and then karma. And last night we started to look at how you die and are reborn. And of the 5 subpoints, we looked at the first, conditions for death. So there we saw that there are 3 conditions for death: to die from the exhaustion of one's lifespan, to die following the exhaustion of one's merit, and thirdly, to die by failing to avoid dangers. Thereafter, we moved and started with the second of the 5 subpoints, the sub-outlines, the minds of death. And we saw as one approaches death, one can have either a mind that is virtuous, a mind that is non-virtuous, or an unspecified mind. So perhaps the most important point that we looked at last night is that in the section, the minds of death, that in the period when death is nearing, but whilst one still has, it says, coarse compositional factors operating, in other words, one still is aware. One can think, one can direct one's mind, one can be aware of what one is seeing, recognize what one's seeing, and understands speech and so forth. And that this point, where death is nearing, but one is still aware, it's imperative to turn your mind to virtue, whether under one's own volition or encouraged, guided by those around you, so that virtuous karmic imprints ripen in one's mind, and one's mind is virtuous. Because this then will aid the later ripening of virtuous propelling karmic imprints, which will lead to a rebirth in the happier migrations as a human or as a god. Whereas if one has a non-virtuous karmic imprint ripening at death, then one falls to the lower realms. So here, whilst one is still cognizant, one is to guide one's mind or have others encourage you to turn your mind to virtue. This is the case. So here one then is encouraged to direct one's mind to virtue, so as to ensure a good rebirth and prevent a non-virtuous mind arising, and one leading to one to fall to the lower realms. So what about if in this period one's mind is unspecified? So in other words, neither virtuous nor non-virtuous. So again, as the translator mentioned last night, unspecified, this Tibetan term literally means not taught in scripture, or not specified in scripture. So in other words, the Buddha didn't say whether a particular mind is virtuous or non-virtuous. Well, another way to translate this would be ethically neutral, because it's neither virtuous nor non-virtuous. So should one be moving towards death with a mind that is unspecified, then when the karmic imprint, karmic imprints of the type that one is most habituated to will ripen and direct the mind in a virtuous or non-virtuous direction. So if one is most habituated to a particular type of virtuous imprint, then one's mind will be directed in a virtuous direction, leading to a favorable rebirth. Whereas if one is most habituated to non-virtuous ways of thinking, then that will lead to the mind being non-virtuous and leading to rebirth in the lower realms. What we've looked at here thus far in the sub-outline, the minds of death, is very important, because it's presenting that when one is approaching death, it's imperative that one should generate a virtuous mind. And that can be done either under one's own volition or encouraged by others. So at some point we will be in this position ourselves as a person leaving this life, or we may be at the bedside of someone who is approaching death. So if it's oneself or at the bedside of someone else who is a Buddhist, then it's useful to, on one hand, reduce worldly distractions around them, distractions in the sense of their mind being turned in that direction. And it's imperative to help the person to generate a virtuous mind of the Dharma. So this is, I'm talking now specifically in the context of someone who's a Buddhist, such as ourselves or someone that you know. So there one can place a Buddha image before them with a statue or a picture, because being a Buddhist, merely seeing an image of the Buddha should lead to will lead to a recognition and a mind of faith arising. And then one can also talk to the person about refuge and about bodhicitta, and encourage them to generate their mind in that direction, or maybe even recite prayers that they are very familiar with, and they, now still being cognizant, will follow what you are saying, maybe even can repeat, and their mind will be turned in that direction because they are still understanding. Also, you can say to them that now that your end is nearing, I will recite prayers for you, perhaps prayers they're very familiar with, and you can recite it at their bedside. And you can also say, we will do prayers or pujas for you outside of here, and we'll make offerings on your behalf and dedicate the merits so that you do not need to, so that you can be confident your next rebirth will be excellent. So in this way, you help them have a positive mind and a virtuous mind as they are guiding towards death, or your friends would be doing that for yourself. In particular here, encourage them to generate minds of refuge and minds of bodhicitta. So here we're talking about the minds of death. So in English we have as a plural, which is very useful because there is a varying degrees of subtlety with regard to the minds of death. So what we have been looking at thus far, as we see in the second line, is there's the word coarse. So this is still referring to where coarse consciousnesses are manifest. So one is able to think and direct one's mind. One is able to see and recognize and generate thoughts in relation to what one is seeing. So for example, seeing a Buddha image leads to the mind of refuge being generated. And one is still able to hear and understand. So the coarse minds are still present or still manifest, but one is nearing death, hence minds of death. But these then, in a sequence, the coarser minds dissolve or become non-manifest, and then subtler minds become manifest. And this is a process of varying, of a number of stages of going from coarse consciousnesses being manifest to subtler and subtler consciousnesses. So, for example, one will at some point not be able to see or hear, and one will not, but one will still have an inner dialogue going on, and then that inner dialogue too will fade. So this is a process by which coarser consciousnesses become non-manifest, leaving subtler consciousnesses, and there are various levels to subtler consciousnesses. And in the end, when the sense consciousnesses have all become non-manifest, then only subtle mental consciousnesses will remain, and eventually the most subtle mental consciousness at the time of death, that alone will be manifest. So in this death process, the sense consciousnesses, they are amongst the first to become non-manifest. But one will still be breathing, so there is still life in the body. But at some point, one makes the final inhalation, followed by the final exhalation. And at that point, death comes. At this point of death, when the final exhalation of breath is made, this will be commonly accepted as death. But in the Buddhist texts, it states explicitly that this is not the actual moment of death, because whilst the body lacks the capacity to exhale air, there is still breath within the body. So death has not yet come. but it certainly is progressing towards that final death. So in the text, what do they say is the point in which death actually comes? And that is when the subtle mind of death, that itself ceases. So an observable external sign that actual death has come. So an external visible sign that the final mind of death has ceased is when a speck of blood emits from the nose.
Yeah.
So as I've described thus far is the common presentation, common with Sutra and Tantra. But then Tantra goes into more detail, presenting subtler states of consciousness that are uncommon in the sense that they are not presented in Sutra. So they're really talking about subtler levels of consciousness dissolving at death. So these will be what we've once heard of: the white appearance, the red increase, and the black attainment, as well as then the mind of clear light. So now we return to the text. So we come to a second sub-outline within the minds of death. So we've looked at the minds of death. Now we come to appearances at the time of death. So here, this is now we maybe 6-7 lines down from the minds of death on page 174. So this is talking about what appears to the mind at the time of death. And it will look at what appears to a virtuous mind at the time of death and what appears to a non-virtuous mind at the time of death. So again, I just read the first sentence and I just need to change a little bit. So looking at the text, for those who have cultivated virtue, so this is what we've had some discussion on, cultivated virtue. What this means is it's those who have cultivated a mind of virtue at the time of death. So this is then ties to what we've seen before, because what's translated here is what the text says. The meaning is those who have cultivated a mind of virtue at the time of death. It will also be related to them having a strong habituation to virtue in their life, and therefore being able to have cultivated easily a mind of death a virtuous mind at the time of death. So that's the meaning of this cultivated virtue. It's that having spent gained strong habituation to virtuous minds in their life, then at the time of death, they are much more easily able to actually generate a virtuous mind at the time of death. And that is the kind of practitioner referred to here, for those who have cultivated virtue. Then, what appears to them? Death is like going from thick darkness into light. So continuing, so I'll read now 2 sentences. For those who have cultivated virtue, so they are now dying with a mind of virtue. So this is now really at the end of the life, whereas before it was as one was approaching the end of life. Death is like going from thick darkness into light. At the time of death, various pleasant, dreamlike forms appear to them. So here they will have various appearances. There will be appearances to their mind which they find pleasant, and like having a pleasant dream. So in terms of, they would see themselves in a beautiful natural environment, for example. The sun is shining, flowers are blooming. So the kind of beautiful environment that people like, and in this case, this person will be drawn towards. So when it says dream-like, there isn't the recognition from the dying person, oh, this is like a dream, but it is similar to how in one's regular life one dreams of a pleasant environment. So similar to that, this is what appears to them at the time of death, and they are drawn to it, attracted by it. The final sentence, for those who are dying with a virtuous mind at the time of death, they die happily. So this refers to mental happiness. They die happily, And even the end-of-life agony is of very minor severity. So this term will come up many times, end-of-life agony. This refers to physical suffering. The word before, die happily, this refers to mental happiness. So the one is mental, the other is physical. So their physical suffering at the time of death is minor, and they are dying with a happy mind. So where we are in the sequence of death is we are not at the subtle mind of death yet. So I imagine that here the person, their sense consciousnesses are not yet completely non-manifest. Hence, they are able to experience physical sensation. We have here the end-of-life agony. So they are able to experience physical suffering sensations. And they are still able to make some sense or have a reaction to what is appearing to their mind. So they are in this process of progressing towards death, but we are not at the final subtle mind of death. This process of going from coarser minds being manifest down to when only the subtle mind of death is manifest. As I mentioned earlier, there are many stages of dissolution of coarser into subtler minds. So here we are talking about going from the coarser mind, such as we have manifest in our normal state, down to the subtler mind of death. So this process is beginning, but there isn't here on what we're looking at, it's not necessarily a hard boundary between when one can experience or interpret or experience, have a response to physical suffering and mental appearances to one's mind. So it's quite possible when one's sense consciousnesses are becoming non-manifest, that one may still experience physical suffering. What is this term here? End-of-life agony, or experience mental appearances. So it's not a hard boundary of you experience such things up to here, but not from there. So it may well be that when the sense consciousnesses even become non-manifest, that there is still some reaction. So I'm not sure I'm saying it so clearly here as the translator. So it's not that the sense consciousnesses in one moment are entirely manifest and then in the next entirely non-manifest. They are becoming non-manifest. So as the sense consciousnesses weaken, there will still be appearance of suffering and happiness, but that will dissipate as the sense consciousness progressively dissipates. Now, for those who die with a non-virtuous mind at the time of death, for those who have cultivated non-virtue, so again, the meaning is the same as we saw above. For those who have cultivated virtue, it refers to specifically those who are dying with a non-virtuous mind at the time of death. And this would either be because their mind is non-virtuous, or it's because the mind is habituated to non-virtue from one's life, non-virtuous afflictions really, and therefore the mind habitually is non-virtuous at the time of death. So either someone has generated minds of non-virtue, or due to habituation, they have arisen. For those who have cultivated non-virtue, it is like going from light into thick darkness. At the time of death, various dream-like, repulsive forms appear to them. Intense feelings of suffering arise, not pain, suffering arise, and the end-of-life agony is also severe. So this is quite clear, especially as it is the opposite for a person dying with a virtuous mind at the time of death. So reading through it again, for those who have cultivated non-virtue, it is like going from light into thick darkness. So it's as if they are in a state completely devoid of any light. And then in that state, then it continues at the time of death, various dreamlike repulsive forms appear to them. So again, we see this as the opposite from those who die with a mind of virtue. And then so too the way they relate to being in what appears to be thick darkness with repulsive forms or frightening forms appearing to them. The response is intense feelings of suffering arise. So suffering is better because this refers to mental suffering. The mental feelings of suffering arise. And then in terms of the body, physical feelings, and the end-of-life agony is also severe. So again, we see it's completely the opposite end-of-life experience, depending on the mind that one dies with. So all those who die with a non-virtuous mind or have a non-virtuous mind manifest at the time of death, they all go from light into thick darkness. There is, though, variety with the next sentence. At the time of death, various dreamlike appearances, various dreamlike repulsive forms appearing to them. So here there will be variety depending on the severity of the non-virtuous mind. So someone who has accumulated extensive non-virtue and therefore dies with a non-virtuous mind, or someone who dies with a non-virtuous mind but hasn't accumulated extensive non-virtue, they will have very different appearances at this time of death. So the repulsive forms that appear to them, there will be variety. So for example, someone who has killed a lot in their life, then with dying, they are likely to die with have a non-virtuous mind manifest at the time of death. And then the kind of forms that will appear to them will likely be those that are threatening them. They may perceive themselves as being attacked or witness around them violence. And from this feeling that their life is in danger, they are being attacked. Maybe animals are eating them or beings are beating them. From this, intense fear will arise and also physical suffering. And this may be observed that this dying person, they clench their fists, they make sounds of expressing their fear, and so forth. So for others who, though, are also dying with a non-virtuous mind manifest, but that non-virtue is not as powerful, what appears to them, and therefore their response to it, will be not as severe. So here there really is some variety. Continuing with the sentence, so at the time of death, various dreamlike repulsive forms appear to them. So I've spoken now about this word various and what it means. And therefore the result of that is that the intense feelings of suffering, so mental suffering, and the end of life, agony, so physical suffering, is also severe. So because there is a variety in terms of the strength of the non-virtuous mind at the time of death, there is variety in terms of what appears to the dying person, and therefore there is variety in terms of the intensity of the feelings of mental suffering and the feelings of physical suffering, end-of-life agony. So someone dying with a non-virtuous mind can feel severe or intense, or less intense, less severe physical and mental suffering, depending on the strength of the non-virtuous mind at the time of death. This is also the case for those who die with a virtuous mind. So if we go up here, a couple of lines. So those who die with, for those who have cultivated virtue, they die happily, so the happy mind, pleasant mental feelings, and even the end-of-life agony is also of very minor severity. So someone dying with a virtuous mind manifest, of course there will be variety in terms of the strength of that virtuous mind, and therefore there will be a variety in terms of the resulting feelings of mental happiness, as well as the variety in terms of the end-of-life agony, in terms of being severe, or how minor that is. So those who die with a strong virtuous mind, they may well not experience any end-of-life agony at all. For others who die with a less strong virtuous mind, but nevertheless a virtuous mind, they may experience a minor severity or very minor severity. in terms of the physical suffering, and likewise in terms of the mental happiness, there will be a gradient there, depending on the quality or the strength of the virtuous mind with which they die. What one can tell from this section we're looking at, for those who have cultivated virtue up to this point here, the sentence end of life agony is also severe, that sense consciousnesses are still manifest because they can feel the physical sense consciousness, the contact, the body, that is clearly still manifest. Also, they are able to make sound, so the body is still functioning. So what I've certainly heard accounts from the area that I'm from, the region that I'm from, that when people who die, who have, for example, who have killed a lot in their life, killed birds and so forth, that when they are in this state, they're approaching death, their sense consciousnesses are waning but still manifest. They have these fearful appearances and they feel they are being attacked by birds, for example. And they call out to those around them for help because they feel that they really are being attacked by birds, just as if one was having a nightmare, so dreamlike. They feel like they are being attacked and they call out for help. So I've heard accounts of this, and this also then goes to show that here we are not talking about the subtle mind of death, because the sense consciousnesses are not completely non-manifest. They are still to a degree manifest. In the final sentence in this paragraph, in all birthplaces except for gods and hell beings, there is end-of-life agony. So this physical suffering is experienced by those who are humans, and then in the lower realms of animals and spirits. It says here, in all birthplaces except for gods and hell beings, there is end-of-life agony. So to understand why not for gods and hell beings, then let's talk a little bit about this term end-of-life agony. So this term comprises of, this term has two syllables. So if you look at them separately, so it's neche, the first is ne, it means something of great importance, or in philosophy it could be a difficult point that needs detailed analysis. But here we could say, or a critical point, a vital point. So that's the first term. And the second is to cut. So just as an aside, the practice that's not translated in English is called che. Che practice is this word, cutting, to cut. So we have a vital point at the first syllable, and the second syllable is to cut. So that is what then is translated here as end-of-life agony. So if we think of what is a vital point in terms of the body, it may be, for example, I forget the name, maybe it's the aorta, these veins around the heart that lead from the heart, I think. And if they are cut, then life will end. So this would be a vital point in the body, one of these primary veins or arteries, that if they are cut, then life will end. So this kind of thing, humans have, animals have, spirits have, but perhaps gods and hell beings do not. And therefore, because the composition of their bodies is quite different, then they are excluded. So for example, we could also understand it not just in terms of the veins and arteries, the vital veins and arteries, but also strangulation would be another illustration. So certainly in terms of spirits, then they can be strangled. So in these ways, we can see that beings in certain realms, their bodies have these vital points that if cut, death will come. Therefore, a great fear follows. Whereas if a being has a body without such vital points, then this end-of-life agony, this fear of a vital point being cut, will not arise. So this is perhaps why gods and hell beings, for them, there is no end-of-life agony. So what's being presented here, we should understand it to be a general presentation, not necessarily entirely completely pervasive in all circumstances. Because if one is able to die quietly at home, in other words, in a nice environment with control and influence over this death process, then one will have an experience like this. Whereas if one dies, say, through violence, then maybe not all of these processes will be followed. And where this is maybe clearer is if one dies in hospital with, what are these things called? Under strong medication, so that one's mind is very clouded, so maybe strong pain medication, then these all these experiences may not well come. However, my presumption is that no matter how one dies, whilst one may not experience end-of-life agony, either through sudden death through violence, sudden and complete death through violence, or because one is so heavily medicated, appearances to the mind, this will still come. So that description, I'd imagine, is more likely to be experienced, whereas the end-of-life agony, this may be prevented due to the way one dies. The minds of death, there are the three: virtuous, non-virtuous, and unspecified. So we looked at that last night. And now we've looked at what appears to those minds. And we've looked at two of the three, virtuous and non-virtuous. So now we come to the third, that of the unspecified mind. And again, unspecified literally means not specified or taught in the sutras, or to translate it differently, ethically neutral, because it's neither virtuous nor non-virtuous. So at the very last line on page 174, neither happiness nor suffering, as explained above, arises in those who have an unspecified mind. So for those who are now approaching death, and their mind is ethically neutral or unspecified, then they are not going to experience strong mental happiness or suffering, nor strong physical agony, end-of-life agony. So this is how a person who dies or is approaching death with an unspecified mind will experience their end of life. Now we come to another sub-outline. So we're at the very top of page 175. At the time of death, whichever mind is most familiar becomes manifest, virtuous or non-virtuous, and other minds do not subsequently operate. If they are equally familiar, that which is recalled first will become manifest, and others do not subsequently operate. If we look at the start of this point, the minds of death, we see there in the third line, depending either on one's own action or being made to recall them by others. So this is what we've looked at thus far. If, as one is approaching death, one either intentionally, under one's own volition, generates a virtuous or non-virtuous mind, or encouraged by those around you, or influenced by those around you, one generates a virtuous or non-virtuous mind, then that is the mind that one will approach the final period of one's life, or at the end of one's life. If that does not happen, we now come to what we're looking at here. Then, at the time of death, so reading again at the top of 175, at the time of death, whichever mind is most familiar becomes manifest, virtuous or non-virtuous, and other minds do not subsequently operate. So if one, either under one's own volition or influenced by others, does not generate a particular mind, then one's strongest habitual tendency will lead to a mind of that type arising. Someone who's led an intentionally virtuous life, so cultivating minds of virtue and so forth, should they recognize death is approaching, then they will, having been trained well, will know I need to generate a virtuous mind, and having led a virtuous life will be able to do so easily because of their strong habituation. They're not trying to do something that they have very little familiarity with. But should they not recognize that death is approaching, but yet it is, then they are not intentionally trying to generate a virtuous mind. So there they are not in a hopeless situation, or a helpless situation rather, but they will be aided by their lifetime of gathering virtue, of generating virtuous minds. And therefore, they will naturally or habitually, a virtuous mind will arise at the time of death. And this is then the same for those who are not habituated to virtue, but non-virtue. If death befalls them, they do not recognize death is coming, their mind will just follow its natural way of thinking, and therefore their dominant affliction they are habituated to, minds of that class will arise. So these two sentences are in this sub-outline of which mind manifests at the time of death. So we looked at the previous page at the start of the minds of death about intentionally or under the encouragement of others generating a virtuous mind. Or now we saw if that's not done, then what's one's strongest habituation will lead to a virtuous or non-virtuous mind arising. Now a third permutation in the next sentence, if they are equally familiar. So in other words, if one is equally habituated to virtuous ways of thinking and non-virtuous ways of thinking, that which is recalled first will become manifest and others do not subsequently operate. So if one's habituation to virtuous minds and non-virtuous ways of thinking are equal, then neither will dominate and will naturally arise. So what happens is that, how does it say it here? That which is recalled first will become manifest. So how that which is recalled first. So in this situation, it differs from what we had on the beginning of this point. So if we look at the minds of death, the third sentence down, depending on either one's own actions. So there one is intentionally generating a virtuous mind. Here, one is not intentionally doing anything. So one is under the control of one's habituation. But if one's habituations are equal, then it's just what naturally arises. So, do you understand this? If they are equally familiar, that which is recalled first, which means that which naturally arises first. In that way, it is recalled. So it's not intentionally recalled, but it naturally arises. Here it's good to be aware, it's good for me now to point out the sequence of this presentation, which is first it was presented about in the context of intentionally generating a virtuous mind, or under the influence of someone else having generating a virtuous mind, or of course non-virtuous. So that was first. If neither of those are present at the time of death, then one's habituation to virtue or non-virtue, that will lead to the mind arriving, which mind arises at the time of death. And now, as we've just seen, if those habituations are equal, then it's what will be naturally arises first. That mind will determine whether one dies with a virtuous or non-virtuous mind. So what I want to point that out so that's clear. And then also to say, from my point of view, this is, as before, a general presentation. It's not that things are should be taken as being overly concrete. For example, we would imagine that someone who's lived a virtuous ethical life, with developed many virtuous minds and strong habituation, is naturally a virtuous person, that we'd imagine at the time of death, they would intentionally turn their mind to virtue, or at the time of death, they weren't aware that it was the time of death, maybe it came about suddenly, then their habituation to virtue should dictate that they die with a virtuous mind. So this is likely, but it is not definite, because at the time of death, they may be under the influence of others around them. There may be others that they either are very attached to, and therefore an afflictive mind arises, or they are angry about something at the time of death. And then, so despite having accumulated extensive virtue, having a strong habituation to virtue, at the end of their life, they at this ending period of their life, their mind is turned in an afflicted direction, and they end up dying with a non-virtuous mind. Entirely possible. The converse is also true, but perhaps not so likely. But certainly it is a possibility that someone has led a life with a strong habituation to non-virtue, that either, of course, they can intentionally generate a virtuous mind at death, or if they do not do that, but a non-virtuous habituation does not arise, perhaps they can be guided still. So my sequence is a bit wrong. So I'll say this part again. So someone who's accumulated a lot of non-virtue in their life, it is possible that at the time of death, they are encouraged to develop a virtuous mind and guided to develop a virtuous mind, and they die with that. It's possible, it's difficult, but it is possible. So therefore, one should take this presentation as being a general presentation, not something that it's definite will be like this, it won't be like that. In other words, it's not necessarily pervasive. So this really emphasizes the importance that when death comes, one is guided to a virtuous mind. Ideally, one will generate it oneself, but one will still be surrounded by conditions that will aid the generation of a virtuous mind and make it less likely that an affliction, a non-virtuous mind, may arise. And this is what we started out looking at, depending on one's own actions or being made to recall them by others. So ideally, one should be in this position, and for this position to be most effective, a lifetime of strengthening habituation to virtuous ways of thinking will make it much easier that in this time of the end of one's life, one will be able to generate a virtuous way of thinking, a virtuous mind at death. Now, so we're in this sub-outline, the minds of death. So we've been talking about approaching death. Coarser consciousnesses are still manifest. So one sense consciousness and sense consciousnesses and various coarser mental consciousnesses are still manifest. When those then cease, the sense consciousnesses cease entirely, the coarser mental consciousnesses cease entirely, then one comes down to the subtler levels of mental consciousness alone. So now reading on from the text. At the time when the mind becomes subtle, so that, in other words, those coarser sense and mental consciousnesses are all now non-manifest. Virtuous and non-virtuous minds come to a stop or cease and become unspecified minds. So at this point here, at the time when the minds become subtle, virtuous, and when the mind becomes subtle, virtuous, non-virtuous minds cease and become unspecified. So at this point, a breath has ceased, but as I mentioned earlier, whilst this may be considered a death and in general, whilst it may be considered in general in society that this is death, there is still breath within the body. And therefore, the mental consciousness, subtle mental consciousness, still abides within the body. And so, even for ordinary beings, they may well remain within the consciousness may well remain within the body for 2 or 3 days after breath has ceased. So therefore, whilst in general the person is considered to be dead and ready to be buried, it would be ideal if one can leave the body relatively undisturbed, so not cremated, not buried just yet, because it is quite possible and quite likely that the consciousness, the subtle consciousness, is still abiding in the body. So this person who's now perhaps officially died, but because her breathing has stopped, their subtle consciousness is still abiding within the body. And as mentioned earlier, a clear sign that final death has come and the body and the consciousness has moved on is when a little bit of blood is emitted from the nose. Here it should be said that it's not definite that in every instance this happens, but it is a very common sign. Another sign would be that the body is not yet smelling like rotting. There's a smell of, the body may smell, but it's not the smell of a rotting corpse. This hasn't started to happen yet because the consciousness still abides within the body. There is still life within the body. So we can potentially stop with looking at the text now and take questions if there are questions. Otherwise, I'll continue. So, are there questions?
It's the in terms of the aggregates, is this end of life agony, is this at the dissolution of feelings or at discrimination? Surely.
At what point? Just be clear, at what point are we talking about now when just the subtle consciousness is in the body and the coarser ones are dissolved? Is it at that point or?
Where the discrimination is dissolved, is that where the end of life agony would stop?
Okay.
Or is it feelings or is it life?
Okay. So which of the dissolution of which aggregate indicates the actual end of life, the final ending? Yeah?
Or the agony, the end of life agony.
Oh, the end of life agony. That seemed to come before this, because there was still sense consciousness available, so that you could have the body sense consciousness, so you could still feel physical pain. So that was before breath stops.
Yeah.
So then the question?
So does the end of life agony still continue after breath stops? Or?
Okay. So hopefully this will match the intent behind the question. So of the 5 aggregates, whilst we have consciousness of any subtlety, all 5 aggregates are present. All 5 aggregates are present. Because whilst there is consciousness, there are the 5 omnipresent mental factors, which include then 2 of the aggregates, differentiation or discrimination, and feeling. So, whilst there is consciousness of any level, of any coarseness or subtlety, one has the 5 aggregates. The 5 aggregates of this life cease together at the moment of death, and then new aggregates are taken. So the 5 aggregates do not cease sequentially, but simultaneously at the moment of death.
But in meditation, we are dissolving each aggregate at each level. Sequentially. So I don't understand how that works.
So you're talking about then the tantric presentation of the 8 stages of dissolution at death, right? Yeah. So yes, in the tantric presentation, there are stages of dissolution. In the tantric presentation. So when one is engaging in the meditation on the dissolution of the elements, the sequential dissolution of the elements, what is being dissolved is their strength or potency. It's this that subsides. It's not that they become non-existent. So as one is going through the sequence of, maybe I'll get it wrong, there's a translator, but it's okay, from water into fire, into earth, into wind energy, as one is going through the one dissolving into the next, it's not that the preceding one is now non-existent. It's rather its potency or its strength, potency or potential strength has subsided. So this we can then liken to when one is sick. one's physical strength lessens, and one may get quite weak. But it's not that your earth element or your capacity of your earth element is lost, or your strength is lost. It's just rather that it's subsided. So just like when you get very weak, progressively weak as you are sick. So this is similar with the meditation on the stages of dissolution.
So, just to clarify that, would that mean that the pain of dying, the agony, would continue until the breath stops?
So would the what's it called, end of life agony continue until breath stops? In brief, yes. So when the exhalation of the breath ceases, then one will not experience physical suffering. So the end of life agony of whatever severity it is will continue until breath stops. Okay. Yep.
If the physical body is cremated or buried or even frozen, for the subtle consciousness that is it, what effect does that have on subtle consciousness?
If the body is buried, cremated, or frozen whilst the subtle consciousness is still within the body, what effect does that have on the subtle consciousness? So of these three ways of disposing of the body, whilst it's still abiding, consciousness is still abiding within it. Let's take that of cremation first. So what's happening in cremation, the body is entered into the crematorium or into the cremation area. When it's engulfed in flames, the body is destroyed and the consciousness will leave the body because its physical abode is destroyed, therefore it will have to leave. So then death will come. So death will be brought to the person by means of the cremation. It will have, let's leave it at that. Then, in terms of the other two, freezing the body or burying the body, that will have no impact on the subtle consciousness because the body has not been destroyed. The subtle consciousness will remain, and when its time is up, it will go. So that will have no impact. However, the body is disposed whilst the consciousness is within, including via cremation, it will have no negative impact on the person. So on the subtle consciousness within. It's because I was asking for clarity on this. Will the person get upset or angry or something like that? So have a negative impact on the rebirth? And Geshe said no. Why? Because their mind at that point, as we in one of the last sentences we looked at, is unspecified. It can no longer be virtuous or non-virtuous. So the person cannot, for example, get angry because their body is being buried or burnt. So with an unspecified mind, or due to having an unspecified mind, it's not that the being can get afflicted by, or afflictions can arise because of what is happening to us. And then I asked then, so what about organ donation? So medicine decides that you're dead, but you've agreed to donate your organs. So what happens then? You're in the operating theater, you're not breathing anymore, you're considered dead, but your consciousness still abides. So here, Geshe says, it'll probably be similar to cremation in the sense that your body is being destroyed, and so the consciousness will leave. But again, like with cremation, this isn't having a negative impact on one's ongoing journey. It's just you're being brought to, your consciousness is leaving sooner than if one had been left alone on the hospital bed. Okay? Lama?
Leading up to that moment of death, if somebody is having really severe appearances of negative appearances of the body being consumed, is that a right, like the ripening of negative karma would occur at that time. So at the time of death, is it possible that some of that ripening would have happened enough for them to change their rebirth?
If a person is dying with a non-virtuous mind, the mind at death is non-virtuous, then they're having these unpleasant, frightening appearances. So do those frightening appearances come from the ripening of non-virtuous karma? And therefore, is it possible that this non-virtuous karma that is being experienced as one is approaching death is exhausted, and therefore they have a positive rebirth?
Yeah, positive rebirth. Okay. From outside watching it, it might appear negative, but actually from their side, lead to positive.
So, briefly, unfortunately not, because whilst these frightening and scary appearances are the ripening of past non-virtue, it's a minor ripening, so it is not going to be exhausted. So the way I understand it is if the strength is of the imprint is whatever it is, what ripens into the appearance doesn't take away much of the strength of that imprint, because it's a minor effect. So therefore, it's not going to be exhausted, and therefore, having a non-virtuous mind as death is approaching, their rebirth is going to be unfortunate in the lower realms. Right, do you want to follow?
To lead on to, like, if we, because as a nurse in an aged care, we come across this quite a lot, and we do use medication to reduce the effect of that anxiety and negative experience. I suppose how would that affect that process of going into death? Because it does calm the mind generally, so the mind is more peaceful.
So can the application of medication which dulls the mind, can that help prevent an unfortunate rebirth, help prevent a negative mind, a non-virtuous mind at the time of death?
Because it does make the mind more peaceful.
More peaceful, yeah. So probably in answer to your question, in brief, would be no. Then the expansive answer is there would be some temporary benefits in that the person will relax and will suffer less. But what the pain medication that is given, this is going to make a difference to the coarser level of physical sensation. So the body will relax, and it will have some impact on the mind, but not much. They may well still have various appearances and arising in relation to virtuous and non-virtuous minds, and the medication that is being given is not going to stop the mind going in a virtuous or non-virtuous direction, and therefore the various appearance following. What the medication will lead to is that the body is more relaxed, and the body may well not respond to what's going on within the mind. So therefore, it's not, what it will not do is be a technique by which one is more likely to get a better rebirth. If the non-virtue is dominant, the rebirth will be in the low realms. Okay. Cameron?
Just regarding the matter of cremation, where a person stopped breathing that is not yet dead, if they're cremated at that time, is the cremation then a type of murder or manslaughter that would result in substantial negativity on the parts of people who are removed, destroying the body?
So the person who, the cremators, are they creating non-virtue because there is still life in the body?
Yeah.
When we looked at karma last year, we saw that there are these 4 components that are required for a complete action. And a complete action means that it's of that karmic action or that karma will be of full strength and can lead to propelling karma. If the actions are incomplete, then the karma is much weaker. So those four elements, the one is an object. So in this case, there is the person, and or the person in their body. And then the second is motivation. The motivation to kill, that's absent. There's a motivation to burn a corpse, which is how it's perceived. That is there, but not a motivation to kill. Then there is the performance, or the actual doing of the deed, and the completion in that the person is killed. So of those four, we see there that the motivation motivation to kill is absent. So therefore, yes, some non-virtue is accumulated, but it is not of much magnitude. So we can conclude there then for this morning. More questions may well come, and then we can continue this afternoon. Thank you.